if you don't live in an ADU friendly area, which is, by the way, like 90% of the United States, don't build an ADU. Build everything other than an ADU. Don't put it in the kitchen sink. Don't put it in the stove, and tell your planning department to go, suck it.
Welcome to the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast, the show where you learn how to plan, build, and live the tiny lifestyle. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and this is episode 180 with Kol Peterson. Kol Peterson has been on the forefront of ADU development and advocacy for at least the last 10 years in Portland, Oregon. But don't worry, this conversation applies to ADUs at least everywhere in the United States, if not beyond that. Kol is a really great thinker and is just whip smart and really quite funny and just passionate about ADUs. And in this conversation, we will really dive into why Kol sees ADUs as such an incredible opportunity for solving the affordable housing crisis. And then we also talk about what is happening in Portland as it relates to tiny houses and probably making Portland the most tiny house friendly city in the country, I would think. So it's really exciting to hear what's happening. And I just really enjoyed this conversation with Kol Peterson, and I know you will too. One more thing, when you listen to my conversation with Kol, you'll notice that I actually ask Kol a question that came in from Tiny House Engage. That's because Tiny House Engage members get to listen live while I record these podcast episodes and ask questions of our guests. It's a really great way to get an inside look at the Tiny House Lifestyle podcast and also just get to benefit from the amazing array of talented guests that we have on the podcast. Registration is open until Tuesday, so just another couple of days, and you can learn everything you need to know about Tiny House Engage at thetinyhouse.net/engage. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/engage. All right, I am here with Kol Peterson. Kol is an ADU expert based in Portland, Oregon, who has helped catalyze the exponential growth of ADUs in Portland over the last decade through ADU advocacy, education, consulting, policy work, and entrepreneurship through his company, Accessory Dwelling Strategies, LLC. He is the author of Backdoor Revolution, the definitive guide to ADU development. He is the owner of Caravan, the tiny house hotel, the first tiny house hotel in the world, and organizer of Portland's popular ADU tour. He consults with homeowners about ADUs on their property and teaches ADU classes for homeowners and for real estate agents in Oregon, Washington, and California. He also co-runs ADU Academy and the ADU Specialist designation for professionals with Earth Advantage. He edits and manages accessorydwellings.org and buildinganadu.com. Kol Peterson, welcome to the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. It's a very impressive bio. As I'm reading it, I'm like, wow, this person is busy.
Yeah, I'm busy, and I'm starting up another company right now, so it making my life busier.
Yeah. Well, I was hoping that I have so many different questions for you, and I'm trying to kind of figure out where to start. I guess my first question is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you kind of were into ADUs before you were into tiny houses. Would that be correct, or am I missaying it?
Actually, that's a really good question. And no, I'd say I was actually into tiny houses first. I went to a workshop by Jay Schaefer in Portland in it was a long time ago. Probably like 2010, I'm guessing.
Uh-huh.
And basically, learned about tiny houses. I was thinking about living in a bus or a tiny house or some kind of cooperative. And then I learned about ADUs, and I was like, that's where it's at. So I got into ADUs in 2000, like later in 2010.
Got it. So what made you say, okay, ADUs, that's where it's at?
Well, because tiny houses weren't legal,
Yeah.
They weren't legal anywhere. And so ADUs were basically like another way to do house hacking in a meaningful way. And the same, like ADUs and tiny houses have a lot in common, a lot not in common. But fundamentally, they're both, from my vantage, solving these major systemic, social, political, environmental issues. And so I'm a fan of both of them, but ADUs, unlike tiny houses, fit really, relatively well within the conventional housing regime, that is insurance, financing, appraisals, construction methods, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas tiny house on wheels were this like fringe thing. So there couldn't be broad cultural or institutional adoption at that point in time. Now that's changing as we speak, and I'm involved with that. But ADUs were more of a conventional concept that could take hold in a lot more of the country because they followed all the nomenclature and standards and rules of normal construction.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, in a way, it seems that tiny houses are being folded in under the ADU umbrella.
They are now in 5 jurisdictions in California. But what we're doing in Portland that I'm really proud of is not making them fall within the conventional IRC, nomenclature of planning and zoning terminology. Rather, we're carving out a kind of a new category for tiny house on wheels and RVs. And so I think there's the opportunity for them to fall under the ADU umbrella, perhaps. But I think they're at kind of their own animal enough that I don't think they should.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I want to back up a little bit from there. I'm always amazed. I hope that my listeners now know what ADU stands for, accessory dwelling unit. But in case this is the first time someone's hearing of an ADU, can you just expand? What's your definition of an ADU?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a 2-sentence definition. A secondary housing unit on a single family lot. That's not all entirely true. It's not like there's different, all these definitions break down, but just to keep it simple, secondary housing unit on a single family lot and commonly referred to as backyard cottages, in-law suites, mother-in-law units, and 100 other synonyms.
Okay. Yeah. So they can, it's a definition that encompasses all the different permutations of, converting a room over the garage, building a cottage in the backyard, building, portioning off your house and turning it into a second unit. All those fall under ADU.
Yeah, and we should just clarify, Ethan, that because that definition is 2 sentences, the deep answer gets really complicated. But fundamentally, if it has a kitchen in it, it typically is defined as a housing unit, and so therefore you can add everything to your property, such as like a detached accessory structure that has an office in it. That's not an ADU, but if you add a kitchen into it, then it's going to trigger the ADU standard. So basically, that's what we're talking about. Is like a secondary living space that means it has its own kitchen.
Interesting. And is that just a Portland thing, or is that pretty national?
That's uniform.
Okay.
But the interpretation of how you define what is and what is not a kitchen might vary by local jurisdictional level. Typically, it's the stove. It's specifically the 220 outlet for a stove or the gas connection that defines a stove. And rather than the stove itself, it's the connection to the stove, and then it's a certain size of a sink, basically.
Wow. So you could potentially build something that doesn't have that in it, and it wouldn't be an ADU.
Exactly. In fact, I encourage people to do that. If you don't live in an ADU-friendly area, which is, by the way, like 90% of the United States, don't build an ADU. Build everything other than an ADU. Don't put it in the kitchen sink. Don't put it in the stove, and tell your planning department to go, suck it. Like you're building an ADU. You call it something else, and you're solving all the same problems that ADUs solve. And when the building department comes around, you can add a kitchen and stove, but meanwhile you have functionally an ADU, and you can figure out a way to wash your dishes in the bathroom sink if needed, and you can figure out how to cook your food in a microwave, hot plate, or convection oven if needed. And eventually your city will catch up and have decent ADU regulations. But until then, build what you want to build that accomplishes what you need it to accomplish, and then add the kitchen sink and stove later if needed.
Cool. What do you see as the primary thing that ADUs accomplish?
Well, they accomplish a lot of different things, right? Yeah. They're like this magical pill that solves all of these social, economic, environmental issues, which is why they're cool. They have such a broad coalition from affordable housing advocates to people who want more aging in place housing opportunities, people who have disabled children, to people who want to generate wealth, to people who want to solve for climate change, because they're creating urban infill, to people who believe in green building because they understand that ADUs are inherently smaller, therefore they're more efficient. So there's this like really great kind of coalition of people who have strong reasons to believe in ADUs. And so it's a matter of kind of aligning everybody's understanding of ADUs and the complexities and the barriers to ADU development, and changing those institutional barriers to enable more people to be able to build them. And those institutional barriers really start with the regulatory legislative barriers that are, like I said, in place in 90% of the United States, including the entire East Coast. There isn't one city in the entire East Coast of the United States that has what I would call good ADU regulations yet.
Wow. Yeah, I'm in Burlington, Vermont, and they're working on it. They allow ADUs, but functionally you have to be rich to build one in your backyard, just because of how many hoops you have to jump through to do it.
Yeah. Yep.
So what makes ADU regulations more friendly?
Well, the big ones are off-street parking. Like if you require off-street parking, people won't be able to build a legal permitted ADU. This is like prioritizing cars over people. It's geometrically impossible to add one. That's kind of a well-known one. The second big one is owner occupancy requirements, which is if you build an ADU, you must live on the property. That is, shackling your freedom to do what you want with your house to these stupid arbitrary regulations that don't apply to any other form of housing. Why are you applying it to ADUs? Number 3, conditional land use reviews, which is where you have to go through a discretionary, non-predictable process. That's a really common one on the East Coast, like in all of or half of Massachusetts anyway.
Yeah.
And then we get into much more fine-toothed, detailed barriers, such as the size of the ADU or the setback requirements for ADUs, whether it's like, if you have a 20-foot rear yard setback requirement because you're adopting the underlying zoning of a particular parcel, that's going to be a barrier to ADU development. If you're limiting the size of ADU to 25% of the size of the primary house, which is a common regulation, that's going to limit the ADUs to only be like pencil for properties that have big houses on it, i.e. it's a regressive ordinance that benefits people who have wealth and not people who don't. And there's like, probably 5 to 7 other significant common barriers, such as height limitations and other things that cause, or like saying the ADU must be attached to the primary house, that undermines like 60% of the ADU market. So there's a lot of like common, less contentious, but just like significant barriers like that I would also put into like the poison pill category.
Yeah, absolutely. As you rattled those things off, I was just kind of thinking about stories that I've heard from various cities on the East Coast of how hard it is to do these kinds of things. And I wonder, I don't know if this is, well, I'm sure you think about this. You seem like a pretty thoughtful guy. Just the idea or the criticism that, okay, I am a like wealthy person who owns a house in my city. I'm going to put an ADU in my backyard. I could rent it to a tenant for $1,200 a month, or I could put it on Airbnb and make $3,000 a month. Is that a bad thing if I put my ADU on Airbnb, or am I still adding housing to my city?
Well, this is like one of the more controversial hot button issues within the ADU policy conversation. So there isn't like one right answer to this. It all is very like dependent on the city. There's really no right answer. Okay. So in Portland, what they've done is they've said, we support ADUs, but if and only if they're being used to provide housing. Anything other than short-term rental is a good thing from our perspective, whether it's an office space or additional living space for an aging parent or a visiting family member, that's all good. But if you're going to use it as a short-term rental, you're going to have to pay the system development charges, which are the residential impact fees for doing new development. And that adds $25,000 of cost. So they're saying, yep, you can do it. Totally fine to use an ADU as a short-term rental. However, you're going to have to pay to do so because we don't want to subsidize you adding a hotel room. We don't care about hotel rooms. We care about housing because we're trying to solve the affordable housing crisis. So we want you to build an ADU, but not if it's a short-term rental. Or no, I shouldn't say. If it's a short-term rental, you can do it, but we're not going to help you do it financially.
Got it.
So, I mean, I think that's a reasonable approach for a city to take. I think that's a fair approach. I think it makes sense. It's in alignment with their policy values. But other jurisdictions, I can imagine, simply don't want short-term rentals at all. In which case, as long as they're treating ADUs with parity as they do to a single-family house, I think it's fine to say no short-term rentals in our community, or
Hmm.
every structure can be a short-term rental, but don't treat ADUs with special, poor treatment in some way that's going to especially penalize them.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of saying that people could do this with single family homes. Like I could invest and buy the house next door and put it on Airbnb, and that shouldn't be treated any differently than me putting an ADU in my backyard.
Yeah.
So you've been advocating for ADUs for a long time, probably much longer than most people have heard about them. I feel like in the last couple of years, ADUs have become a really hot, kind of almost a buzzword that you hear. At least I hear a lot in the tiny house world. Um, can you talk about what the landscape was like when you started advocating for ADUs and what it's like now, at least in Portland where you are?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the point that you just made is the big one, which is ADUs have become almost like it's almost seeped beyond just being a known thing amongst planning and zoning staff, but now it's kind of known amongst a number of different industries like
Hmm.
builders, planners, designers, realtors, municipal officials, affordable housing advocates, green builders. Everybody kind of knows about ADUs now, and so there's a lot of more institutional support. Not the least of which is AARP, which is the largest nonprofit or member organization in the country. Now they're really go whatever. They're really gung ho for ADUs, which is
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah,
Whereas when I started doing this work, there was nobody. There was no articles about ADUs. There's certainly no institutional backing for ADUs by anybody. So it was just like an ad hoc group of people who got together in Portland who started to like think about what we could do to promote this thing called ADUs that you've never heard of, but they're really cool and you should consider them. And so it was like building accessorydwellings.org and running the ADU tour and
hmm,
teaching classes and stuff like that. That was like just like building the base, the ground game for like
hmm.
awareness about this housing form.
Why do you think that the AARP has gotten so gung ho on ADUs?
For all the reasons I just said, it's a
Okay, yeah.
win, which you don't find very much in the world.
No, no, you really don't. You really don't. It's pretty cool. And it also, I think what's cool about it is that it, by definition, is so grassroots because, all these single family homes are owned by individual people. And it's kind of a grassroots response to the housing crisis that we have individual people building individual units in their backyards rather than a developer buying an old school or an old industrial building and turning it into apartments.
You've basically just quoted the back cover of my book.
Wow.
I mean, that's what I said too. It's
Yeah.
like this is a grassroots housing revolution that can solve all these problems. Like
Hmm.
it's super cool. That's why I like it. It's like distributed. It's not a centralized solution. So everybody can take advantage of it as long as these institutional barriers are knocked down, which I think is awesome. Like there's very few
Yeah.
things like that. It's like a very substantial, it's not a small thing. It's not like, not to like throw changing light bulbs under the bus. That's a great thing. Do it. But like ADUs are very substantial in terms of the carbon impact or reduction that they can offer. So it's especially if you're doing like a conversion.
Hmm.
And this is also true with tiny houses on wheels, by the way. It's not just ADUs, but anyway, it's a very substantial thing that somebody can do in their lifetime.
Cool. So one thing that I was thinking of while you were talking was it sounds like the legal or the regulatory structures have kind of warmed to ADUs and it's a lot easier. Are the financial and insurance and other kind of things that a homeowner would need to build one in place? Or is it kind of like, okay, if you want to do an ADU, you're going to have $100,000 in cash because you're not going to get financing to do it?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the truth with ADUs is like more or less you need to be well heeled or
Uh-huh.
have access to family members who are, because the financing is so difficult. And there's a lot of interest now from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to change underwriting policy, but there's still, even if they fixed what they could, there's still the appraisers who need to understand how to properly value ADUs, which is a problem. And then there's banks who need to be willing to be risky with construction loan policies to go above and beyond what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac might offer. So there's just a lot of barriers that it's not, it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of work, a lot of like smart people who are kind of thinking about AD financing all across the country now in their local jurisdiction. Like how can we make AD financing easier? And eventually, after 1,000 flowers bloom, some people will figure out good ways to do it. It just hasn't really occurred yet.
Yeah. What do you envision for the future state of ADUs? Like you've gone from it being really hard and not a lot of people know about it to it's easier. There are ADU friendly cities, but you still have to, as you said, be well heeled. Where do you hope this movement is in 10 years more?
Well, good tie-in. I think it should go into the mobile ADU space. I think that's where it's at. I think that's going to be like basic. When I say mobile ADUs, that is intended to encompass anything that's a mobile dwelling, whether
Yep.
it's like a mobile house, I guess, but more like a tiny house on wheels or an RV or a travel trailer or whatever else may come in the future. I think there's a lot of potential for that to be a big thing that's way like not happening yet, but it will happen hopefully eventually because it should.
Yeah.
It makes sense for the same reasons that, at least for all the policy reasons that people state that they like ADUs,
Mm-hmm.
mobile ADUs would be even better. That is, they would be much less expensive. They'd be easier to build in one place and move to someplace else. They provide more flexibility. But it's like an entirely different sector that doesn't exist really yet, except now
Yeah.
it's starting to in California and Oregon. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, I was thinking like, okay, right now it's grassroots. Will, who knows, maybe in 10 years, if the housing crisis continues to get worse, which for all indicators point to that it will, maybe there will be, government money or like actual like towns reaching out to homeowners and saying like, we want to put an ADU on your property. We will help you do it. Like kind of reversing the flow of like, it's rather than homeowners coming to the city to say, can I do this? The city is reaching out to homeowners to say, please do this.
Yeah. And they should, right? Like cities should be doing whatever they can to support homeowners to do this stuff. Not that they should be directly subsidizing it, but they should be like treating them with ADUs with special white gloves that makes it as easy as possible. And whatever methods seem to be working on that front, other cities should emulate. And the very first thing is having good regulations for them, which is kind of stupid, but that's where we're at. It's like the West Coast, like kind of has good ADU regulations everywhere, but pretty much just the West Coast, not even like one state in.
Yeah.
Past there, it's like not that good across the rest of the country.
This is a good question that came in from Tiny House Engage. Would you say that the poison pill and unfriendly barriers are for the most part intentional, or are they just like dinosaurs from the building industry past?
Oh, that's a great question. I think they're dinosaurs. I mean, certainly now they're dinosaurs. Maybe when they first were conceived of, they had poor intentions, but I think now it's kind of just like people just have owner occupancy requirements because they require owner occupancy. We don't know why. It's like the bureaucrats don't think about it. They don't think to question it. And it's just what they have. But they don't know. Like, actually, I did a lot of research on what the history of these regulations were for, and I couldn't track it down. Like, there's no answer. But I can surmise what they might have been about. It's probably, some perception of like, we don't want renters. Like, we don't like renters. And so we don't want renters in our
right
sacred single family zone. So, I mean, if I was to guess, that would probably be the precipitating motivation. but that's not really a justifiable motivation if you believe in, providing affordable housing and stuff like that we say we want.
Yeah, totally. That's a great question and a great answer. So I think now that we've talked about ADUs a bit, I feel like now we can come back to, what is happening in Portland and the recent changes that are applying to tiny houses on wheels and RVs.
Yeah, let's talk about it. It's super cool.
Yeah. Maybe when did this happen? What happened? How are you involved? Anywhere you want to go with it.
Oh, sure. So I've been involved with this idea for a long time, like since I opened Caravan really in 2013, which is a tiny house hotel. So those are like tiny homes on wheels on a commercial property. And what the things I'm most proud about with Caravan are that it was like the first place where tiny house on wheels were legally connected to sewer anywhere that I knew of. And it was the first place where people could like go stay in a tiny house, because there are other ways they were like under the radar, but we figured out how to make them like publicly available. So in any case, so I've been working on this in that kind of awareness building and like building code specific way and a lot for a long time. But now we've gotten a new code passed in Portland that as of August 1st, 2021, that allows for the habitation of a mobile dwelling that is a tiny house on wheels or an RV, any form of an RV, basically, to be lived in on a residential property. And importantly, it's not classified as an ADU. That is, you can have an ADU and also have this.
Wow.
You can have a duplex, triplex, or a fourplex. You can also have this on top of that. So it doesn't count as like a housing allocation. Number one. Number two, you don't have to meet any of these ANSI 119.5 standards or THIA certification standards. So it allows for the DIYers out there to build something and live in it, and they won't be required to meet any standards, which reduces the cost of construction. And lastly, you're not required to, you're supposed to put in a water, sewer, and electrical connection. But if you don't have plumbing serving your mobile dwelling, that is, you don't have a kitchen or bathroom, the presumption is that you can use the primary house, and you don't have to provide, as a homeowner, you don't have to provide a legal sewer or water connection to the tiny house, which again reduces the cost a lot. So again, this would be treating it like a detached bedroom that is not one with plumbing in it. So we're also going to allow that to happen in a detached tiny house on wheels. And so it provides a lot of flexibility. It's a pretty easy standard to meet as far as the development standards. And there's already, in fact, a lot of people living in RVs and tiny houses in Portland. It's kind of been, colloquially understood as like a tiny house friendly place for a long time, but it wasn't really that different than other places, just that a lot of people lived here with tiny houses. But now it's officially a tiny house friendly place. And it's different than the other approaches that have been used elsewhere in the country that limit tiny houses to like certain standards and certain tie down requirements and certain utility connection requirements and all this stuff that makes them more difficult, more expensive to build.
Yeah. And it's pleasantly surprising that you were able to, or whoever advocated for this was able to get it approved without those ANSI standards, because it seems like most other cities are like, all right, we'll allow movable tiny houses, but like they have to have been built to like these standards and certified, and we need, like, it basically kind of locks out any tiny houses that were built before 2018 or 19.
Right.
Or even now. And also just locks out any kind of DIY.
Exactly. And it makes this form of construction expensive, right? And so if we're actually doing this to solve affordable housing, which again is like what everybody says they want, then we have to start pushing the envelope and thinking outside the box and doing stuff that's actually innovative.
Right.
And so a ANSI rated tiny house is going to cost more because it's done by professionals in professional settings with licensed plumbers and electricians and all the rest. It's going to cost more. And I get there's value in that. I'm not trying to say there's not value in it. I'm a big fan of advanced construction methods, et cetera. But if our goal is to solve affordable housing, which everybody says it is, then we have to figure out how to solve affordable housing. And so
Right.
this is a big part of that. It's going to dramatically reduce the cost. And if you allow for RVs, hey, it ain't a beautiful thing to live in, but it's a hell of a lot cheaper than ADU, which is a hell of a lot cheaper than a house.
Right. And that RVs ostensibly were built to a standard if they were a manufactured RV.
Yeah.
Certainly not the standard that a house would be built to, but a standard nonetheless.
Yeah. So if you're really invested in standards, I guess you could say build it to an RV standard. But I mean, then you're not allowing for a beautiful, cute, tiny house on wheels, but you are going to allow for somebody to live in a crappy looking formaldehyde plastic shell. So
how do you make the safety trade-off, or the perceived safety trade-off that, okay, if they're not being built to these ANSI standards, there's going to be people dying in fires who can't get out of the loft. There's going to be air quality issues from, mold growing in these houses. I mean, I know that these are rare scenarios, but, I'm sure something like this came up at some planning meeting somewhere.
I'm sure that is the rational kind of response that a lot of people have. I would say, find me any statistically valid studies that actually show what you're saying here in reality. For example, I would say, like, is it true that can we say authoritatively that RVs are more safe than DIY tiny house on wheels?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I've had over 20,000 guests stay at Caravan, the tiny house hotel, since we've been open. Not a single injury that entire time. I mean, nothing bad ever happened to any of the tiny houses. None of them were built to any standards. Probably not even by professional builders in many cases. RVs, definitely I've seen RV fires and all this, even though they're certified.
Yeah.
So like, maybe it's just the fact we don't have combustible appliances in our tiny homes. I don't know. I don't have all the answers to this stuff. All I know is we should be able to back up our theories with actual facts and not just assumptions that somehow meeting some arbitrary standard that somebody thinks is good on some committee is somehow going to result in more life safety.
Yeah, totally. So my experience in the tiny house world has been that the tiny house movement types are very resistant to being lumped in with RVs because, probably for aesthetic reasons. And also the fact that RVs it's right there in the name, recreational vehicles. And so it's been this struggle to say, like, no, even though our tiny home has wheels, it's not an RV, it's a house. Do you think that there's any downside to kind of the Portland regulations that kind of lump movable tiny houses and RVs just together?
These are getting into really technocratic details, so I can answer the question, but I don't think it really matters that much. I think these nomenclature is going to change. It's not going to be called tiny houses on wheels forever. It's not going to be called movable tiny houses forever.
Yeah.
It's going to be called something else. It might be able to be called mobile ADUs one day. These names will change and definitions will change. So don't get too stuck on the details of how we're defining it in 2021 or whatever this is, because it wasn't that way in 2015 and it won't be that way in 2025. But in Oregon, along with 48 other states in the United States, I don't know which state still does it, but 49 states no longer regulate RVs as a state entity. They no longer say, we require that RVs are built to RVIA or THIA standards or whatever it is, or not THIA, whatever it is. I don't know what the acronym is. So states have kind of like foregone their authority of overseeing the construction standards for RVs. So I think there might be some like opening there for calling tiny houses on wheels RVs, because RVs are not being required to meet any standard by the state anyway. So jurisdictions can still require that if they want, but they don't have to. And so we basically got Portland to follow suit of what Oregon had done and say, hey, Oregon no longer requires RVs meet any statewide standard. It's up to the buyer of the RV to see whether they want it to be certified to a certain standard or not. It's not up to the state anymore. We don't care. We're out of this game.
Yeah.
If you want to tow it down the road, you have to get a tow tag, like a license plate on it, but that's not really a building code standard. That's just like if
Mhm.
you're going to tow it down the road. So we said to Portland, hey, Oregon isn't requiring this. So Portland, you guys shouldn't require it either. And if people want to tow it down the road, they can get a temporary tow plate from the DMV and we're good. We don't need your intervention or involvement in the regulation of these, mobile dwellings. You're off the hook, city. And that's the approach they adopted.
Cool. I'm sure, there's so much friction in government, these processes that you have to go to. Okay, you have to talk to the environmental review board, you have to talk to zoning, you have to talk to planning, you have to get the building. There's like so many different offices to visit, and I feel like anytime you can reduce the friction there, it's going to be faster and easier to build something like this.
Yeah, we're putting in. Okay, so I'm going to tip off my next question that you didn't ask, but I'm going to get to, which is I'm starting a new company now with it. Are you going to ask about that?
I am going to ask, but I was about to, so do it.
Okay, so I'm starting this new company called Tiny Hookups, which is with two other people, and we're serving as general contractors, putting in infrastructure on people's residential properties under this new code that allows for the habitation of mobile dwellings. And so, in this case, on a really expensive, complicated project, we are going to put in the infrastructure, water, sewer, electrical connections for our first project. It's going to cost like $15,000. This is expensive. This is not cheap.
15,000. It should be less.
15.
Okay.
15,000. I think it's expensive, like relatively speaking, but it's just a really complicated project. And it's going to take us like 2 months, which is a really long time. And the tiny house is going to be delivered later this month. And she probably started the process like, I don't know how many months ago, but it's actually being shipped over from the East Coast. In any case, this whole project with the house is going to cost her it's going to be expensive, like $115,000. It's going to take like 6 months. And that is like half the cost of the least expensive ADU you can do right now. And that's a really complicated project.
Wow.
You could do, and so like you could do infrastructure on some properties for like $5K, $10K, and get a tiny house much quicker than 6 months and for much less than 100,000. So, I mean, and that's like, it's like, this is an expensive, really difficult one. And it's still half the cost of the least expensive ADU you can do in Portland. So I think there's just a lot of potential for this form of like formalizing this type of construction or development.
Yeah. Yeah. So I love the name Tiny Hookups. It's a really awesome idea to just kind of be able to one-stop shop company that's going to come and put in the infrastructure. I'm assuming you're going to get the approvals needed from the city and figure that all out. What, in Portland at least, like what do you have to put down for a tiny house on wheels in a backyard? Do you have to pour like a concrete slab? Is it just gravel? Like run me through kind of what you have to do.
Well, this is great because like this is literally, we're doing our first job as a general contractor. We're the only company doing it, and no other cities in this country. So you're getting the
first one.
This is the very first like answer to this question. We're going to have to do a 3x3 foot sloped concrete pad towards a sewer cleanout, which is, an ABS sewer cleanout, which is going to tie into the primary house. It's a 4-inch or 3-inch sewer cleanout. Then we have to put a foot operated latch on top of the sewer cleanout so that you can, ostensibly, this is adopting the RV like sewer dump standards so that you could touch the dump station to open up the foot operated latch to dump in a flexible duct from your RV to this ABS sewer connection without touching it with your hands. And if there's, God forbid, spillover of crap, then it would end up on this 3x3 foot concrete pad, which would slope towards the sewer drain. So that's the sewer.
Okay.
The water, you just use any hose connection on your property or put in a new dedicated spigot using PEX. And then the sewer connection, the electrical connection, you got to do a dedicated 30 amp or 50 amp electrical circuit, which is going to look like an RV type of outlet,
right?
Like you would see at an RV park. And then as far as the parking pad, you can park on grass, you can park on asphalt, you can park on concrete, you can park on gravel, you can park on whatever you want. From a best practices point of view, it's probably better to park on gravel or a hard surface, at least where you're going to put the points of contact with the 4 corners of the tiny house. So we're going to go with gravel for the most part, but it'll depend on the site.
Nice. That's so just catching up on something you said a little while ago. So the cheapest ADU you can do in Portland is $250,000.
Yeah, I'd say like if you did a custom 400 square foot ADU these days, which is on the small side, 350, 400 square feet, that's going to come in at 225 to 250 based on construction costs currently.
Yeah.
You can get some
Wow.
less expensive ADUs, don't get me wrong, but like
Yeah.
if you're going to go for the custom standard kind of product, that would be it. You can get some for like 125, 150, but like those are like manufactured homes basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, yeah. So that back to tiny hookups, very cool. Do you have more clients, more projects in the works?
Yeah, we have through my ADU consulting business. Now I'm getting a lot more inquiries for tiny houses on wheels. So as I'm doing those consultations, I'm just, putting our name out there amongst those who want to put in the infrastructure saying, hey, I will tell you how to do it. But if you want to do it, so if you want to do it yourself, it'll be cheaper. But if you want a GC to do it, we will do it. And so some homeowners are contacting me that way. And that's where we're getting our leads.
Very nice. Are there any kind of movable housing structures that are excluded from Portland's regulations? Like I'm thinking schoolies, vans. Can those count as RVs?
I don't think they do. I don't think a school bus counts as an RV. And it's a good question. I don't know what the technical distinction is. Like actually don't know the answer to this question whether a motorized RV is permissible right now or not in Portland. I know that all non-motorized RVs are, but I'm not sure about motorized RVs.
Yeah.
And schoolies would not be. Schoolies would be classified most likely as a vehicle, not an RV. I'm guessing.
Right.
Yeah.
Was there backlash to this, or were there any people who came to the meetings to fight it?
No, this is so fascinating, Ethan. There was like 2,000 public comments about this proposed set of regulations that included tiny homes on wheels. And there was probably about 200 comments that specifically talked about tiny houses on wheels and RVs. This is all online on the public record if you want to look at it yourself. And they were all positive. There was not one negative comment about this proposal in the entire public comment period.
That blows my mind because I could definitely see some people getting being like, oh, my property values if an RV is parked next door kind of thing.
Not one negative comment. It is fascinating. And that goes to show me that there is a huge political opening here for tiny houses on wheels and RVs because of the motivations for people to solve the affordable housing crisis. Now you have to do some groundwork with like housing activists to get people out to support it, but there wasn't a lot of pushback despite all the fear that, people are like afraid of having RVs next door to them. There wasn't anybody commenting about that.
Cool. So my last kind of topic that I want to touch on here is just like, how can people, somebody listening who doesn't have the good fortune of living on the West Coast, somebody on the East Coast or in the middle of the country in a town that has crappy ADU regulations. Yeah. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, what I said at the beginning of the show, which is build it anyway. Just don't put a kitchen sink or stove in it. So most jurisdictions, like you can find creative loopholes to everything. And I'm like the loophole guy. I like loopholes. So, so build it as a detached office, build it as a detached bedroom. If it has to be attached, build an addition. You can put in walls between one portion of an addition and another. You can put in a bathroom, you can put in a separate entrance, and you can put in everything except for the kitchen sink and stove. And voila, you have an ADU-like structure, and you can accomplish all the same goals that people who have ADUs can. And you can tell your planning department to go catch up with the West Coast, because we need people who are willing to stick their neck out and do civil disobedience in a totally legitimate way and show the idiocracy of some of these rules and regulations that are prohibiting us from taking part in this grassroots housing revolution. Yeah,
cool. And then what about those who might want to actually advocate, who maybe don't have the property or the means to do this kind of civil disobedience, but wants to be part of the advocacy?
Yeah. And so if you're living in a tiny house on wheels, you're also part of that, by the way. Like, it's not just people who own property.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the number one step in jurisdictions or regions where there's like a need for this, which is,
Mhm.
you could say it's the whole country, but like really there's a need for this in areas where there's an affordable housing crisis, which is most of the coastal United States, East and West Coast. Then I think the best strategy is to kind of get together with other people who are also interested in this concept, not just friends, but like
Mhm.
institutional actors, realtors, builders, designers, urban planners, and work on a strategy to legalize ADUs, re-legalize ADUs, make them easier to build, make middle housing easier to build. And tiny house on wheels, like I said, I think are kind of the future. It's a little bit ahead of the time in terms of like cities broadly adopting this stuff because it's a little bit as we're bleeding edge right now. Like we have to see how this plays out in Portland
Yeah.
and in California to know what's really the best practice.
Yeah.
And other places, but other places can experiment too. And I think the more experimentation right now with tiny houses on wheels, the better, because they offer a really good opportunity. And apparently, they're politically palatable, based on our experience here in Portland.
Yeah. Seems like it. Well, one thing that I just like to ask all my guests is, do you have one or two or three book recommendations or other resources about ADUs, about housing in general, just things that have inspired you to pass along?
Yeah, I just read a book called Wheel Estate.
Okay.
Bad name, but great book. It was written in the, I think, early 90s, maybe late 80s. And it's fascinating. It's just a historic, really detailed historic sketch of the origin of RVs and mobile homes, manufactured homes, and it touches on ADUs. And I think it's a really good like background on the history of mobile dwellings prior to the tiny house on wheels movement.
Nice. Awesome.
Yeah.
Kol Peterson, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience, and thanks for what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much to Kol Peterson for being a guest on the show today. You can find the show notes, including links to Kol's website, books, and to a great blog post about the Portland regulations and what changed at thetinyhouse.net/180. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/180. All right, well, that's all for this week. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and I'll be back next week with another episode of the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast.